If you're thinking about adding fondant decorations to your next cake or covering your cake with fondant, stay tuned because I'll be sharing my top 10 tips for beginners who are working with fondant for the first time. Now let's get to it. These first few tips are ones to keep in mind before you even buy a pack of fondant. Tip number 1, think about your cake design and consider decorating your cake with fondant accents, especially if this is your first time working with fondant. One of the easiest ways to get started with fondant is to start off with adding fondant accents to a frosted cake. Covering a cake with fondant can be challenging, so I don't recommend it if you've never worked with fondant. If you're determined to cover a cake with fondant, you should consider practicing on a styrofoam cake dummy first. Tip number 2, watch tutorials on how to actually do what it is that you're trying to achieve with fondant. The internet is an amazing resource, and there's most likely already a video specifically about the fondant decoration that you're trying to create. There are so many full-length fondant tutorials on YouTube. Shorter videos posted to other social media outlets offer a ton of inspiration, but they usually don't provide enough detail and step-by-step instruction to follow along. Detailed video tutorials on fondant techniques are so beneficial for people who are working with fondant for the very first time. Tip number 3, have the right tools handy. A lot of success in cake decorating has to do with having the correct tools and knowing how to use them. This is so important when decorating with fondant. Thorough tutorials should list all of the tools you need and ideally where you can buy them. There are some essential fondant tools like rolling pins and cutters that you should consider adding to your cake decorating toolbox. I cover these in more detail in a video linked in the description. Tip number 4, choose a fondant brand that's easily accessible. Take a look around the cake decorating aisle at your favorite grocery or hobby store. What brands of fondant do you see? If you see a lot of stock, this is where you'll want to buy your fondant, not online. For beginners, I don't recommend purchasing fondant online for 2 reasons. Number 1, you'll want to be able to buy more fondant quickly in case you run out of fondant and need to buy more. And what better place than your local store that you know for sure already has that stock. And number 2, you never know in what condition your fondant ordered online will arrive at your doorstep. Buying in person allows you to inspect the packaging before making a purchase. Now to the tips having to do with actually working with your fondant. Tip number 5 is to keep your work area clean. Fondant attracts dust and hair, so it's very important to keep your hair pulled back and your work surface clean. Oh, and don't forget to wash your hands. And speaking of hands, tip number 6 is to wear gloves. Consider wearing gloves when working with fondant, especially when you're coloring fondant. Gloves help to keep your fondant clean in addition to keeping your hands free of food dye. I like to use black nitrile gloves that fit snugly to my hands. Tip number 7, keep your surfaces and hands non-stick. Fondant can be sticky, and the best ways to keep fondant from sticking to your surface is to lightly dust your work surface with cornstarch. If you don't have cornstarch, powdered sugar can be used as an alternative. A small amount of solid white vegetable shortening or coconut oil can be used on your hands to prevent the fondant from sticking. This will work on bare hands and on gloved hands. Tip number 8, cover your fondant when it's not in use. Fondant can dry out if left uncovered. When the fondant pieces are smaller, they dry out even quicker. It's important to keep any unused fondant wrapped tightly with plastic wrap or within an airtight container when it's not in use. Otherwise, your fondant may begin to wrinkle or crack when handled. When this happens, keep in mind tip number 9, which is that you can lightly mist your fondant if it is too dry. If your fondant becomes wrinkled or cracked as you're actively working with it, you can use a finger pump spray to lightly mist the fondant with water to hydrate it. Remember, your fondant should always be smooth and pliable like this. Tip number 10, don't be afraid to refrigerate your cake. While researching, you may come across some information that suggests that you should never refrigerate a fondant cake or a cake with fondant accents. Well, I am here to tell you that that is not accurate. You can, and in some cases should, refrigerate a fondant cake. The key is the temperature of the refrigerator. To avoid the dreaded condensation or sweat, be sure that the cake is stored in a cool refrigerator rather than a cold refrigerator. Now that you know what to keep in mind to help you avoid the most common mistakes, you can now move forward with confidence in decorating your first cake with fondant. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button below and consider subscribing to my channel for more cake tips, tricks, and tutorials. A special thanks to all of my channel members, and to you, thanks for watching.